Hey, it's Dave Brown here, host of Now with Dave Brown on AMI. Check out this latest highlight from the show. Right off the top of the show today, I shared with you StatsCan's inflation data for the month of June, an 8.1% increase year over year and a 0.4% increase month over month. So what does that all mean? What are the effects of these rising prices, rising inflation, and some of the interest rate rises that have gone along with it? Well, let's bring in Dr. Ian Lee, an associate professor of management at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University in Ottawa. Hey, Dr. Lee, thank you for making time to be with us today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, Dave.
So, Dr. Lee, we know there are a bunch of underlying causes to this rising inflation, but what do you attribute some of the core underlying issues being?
First off, you are absolutely right. Inflation is not driven by one singular event. I lived in a much earlier career when I was much younger, back in the 1970s. I was in my 20s, and I was 9 years in banking in Canada, in Ottawa, where I lent millions of dollars as a consumer loan officer, consumer loan manager, mortgage manager, and then small business manager. I was there when inflation kept going up throughout the late 70s, ultimately peaking at 14%, and interest rates ultimately peaked at 20%. So I've lived through it. So I'm not just quoting you textbook theory here for some of your listeners who say, that's sort of ivory tower. I lived through 20% interest rates. I lent money. Well, not very much because hardly anybody was borrowing. But to your question, because in the last 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, there's been all manner of confusion listening to politicians and to pundits and to academics and saying, it's Russia, it's the war in Ukraine, it's oil prices, it's commodity prices. Hey, nothing to do with us. It's not our fault and not our problem. And that's partly true, but it's not true in some respects at all. And let me explain that. And then I'll get into the causes. Even if inflation was purely coming from outside of Canada, that does not mean there is, quote, nothing we can do inside Canada to address it, because inflation is something that is responded to by people inside a particular country economy. And that's why the Bank of Canada is focused on inflation in, oh my goodness, Canada, not inflation in Afghanistan or in Russia or in China. In other words, even if the inflation is coming from outside the world into Canada, it is impacting us inside Canada, and it is the Bank of Canada trying to change our behavior, all 31 million of us that are adults, I say adults over the age of 18, so we can contract and buy and sell and own cars and houses and stuff. So it's about 31 million out of 38 million Canadians are adults of the age of majority, and they're trying to influence our behavior. So to your question very quickly, yes, Russia, the invasion of Ukraine created all kinds of uncertainty. It really negatively impacted agricultural exports. Russia and Ukraine are huge exporters of wheat-type products to the world, about 40% of the world. Yes, Russia is one of the 3 largest oil producers in the world, along with the United States and Saudi Arabia. And so those factors are influencing inflation, as was the disruption to the supply chains caused by the lockdowns back in 2020, 2021. So, and then there's things we're doing inside Canada, keeping rates too low in the past, putting too much stimulus into the system. You stir it into the mix and into the mix master, and you have all these different variables. But at the end of the day, inflation is hitting people in Canada, making their food and their cost of living more expensive.
To your last point there, in regards to perhaps historically loose monetary policy, pretty much since the Great Recession of 2008, was there going to be an inevitable spike in inflation because of that loose monetary and loose fiscal policy for about 15 years?
Dave, you are asking, I believe, a question that I wish more journalists would ask. because I think it really is important. And I know most people, they hear the word monetary, and their eyes glaze over because, most people don't sit around reading about monetary policy. It's not that exciting, okay? And so I understand that, but it has a huge impact. And I'm saying this as a former banker now, not from studying something what I did study, but from what I lived through at that time. And interest rates really have an enormous impact on us. And I think that we in the West, I don't just mean Canada, the UK and the US made some serious mistakes in the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, maybe 12 years. In keeping rates so low. Let me explain that. It may seem kind of strong to say that, kind of like, who are you, Ian Lee, to say that? I looked up, because it's very readily available to anybody watching this program, can look up the Federal Reserve. They have a phenomenal research department of thousands and thousands of economists, and so does the Bank of England. And I looked up the central bank rate for the past 250 years. And I looked up the Bank of Canada all the way back to its formation in 1935. We didn't go back before that. My point of this story, Dave, never, ever, 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 ever did the central bank rate go so low as it has been in the last few years. Not even in the Great Depression did interest rates go this low. So my argument is we overdid it. We went too far. We drove the rates down too low. People would say, well, so what? Who cares? Well, what it does is it made money really, really cheap. In fact, I would say it made money almost free. What did we do when something's free? Go get more of it. Why not? Borrow, go out and spend, and buy houses and RVs and boats, and of course houses. And we drove the price of houses through the roof, partly, not exclusively, but partly because the money was so cheap. It was essentially free. So it created unintended consequences that, amongst other things, I argue, exacerbated inflation. Didn't create it, but it exacerbated it, made it worse when it started to stoke up because of those other things, supply chain interruptions, war by Russia, and so forth. So it was a fire waiting for the match to be lit. These events were waiting for a match to light them, and the low interest rates made it really possible to buy those big ticket items that people normally borrow. I'm saying this as a former banker. You don't borrow and go to the bank to buy a cell phone. Generally you don't. But you do borrow to buy a $50,000 car or to buy an $800,000 or $1 million house. Most people don't have that money in their bank account, so they borrow. So big ticket, capital intensive items are very affected by interest rates. Drive the interest rates down, and you know what you're going to get? A lot more people buying a lot more of those products. And that's helping to drive inflation.
Yeah, I really think about that from a real estate perspective too, that it becomes very easy to borrow and leverage real estate against real estate at low interest rates. And then once you start increasing the cost of housing and real estate generally, whether that be manufacturing or residential living or commercial space, that's going to trickle down in a big way. And that might take time to do, but I think we're seeing that as well.
You're absolutely right. And I know that some people are saying, well, wait a minute, you put the interest rate up, it makes it even more unaffordable. But I believe, and there's some serious forecasts out there, including Canada Mortgage and Housing, a government Crown Corp here in Ottawa, and the TD Bank, which is the largest mortgage lender in Canada, just released a report forecasting that in the average value of houses in Canada will be down 23% by this time next year. I actually think if they keep driving interest rates up towards for the rest of this year, which I believe they're going to do, the governor of the Bank of Canada said so, I think we could see a 30% decline in house prices across Canada. I think people say this is terrible. I think this is wonderful news for young people and immigrants who cannot afford these unjustifiably high prices. And remember, the Bank of Canada says that since the COVID, house prices are up on average 40% since March 2020. And there were many people who said back in March 2020, house prices were overvalued even then. So if prices come back down 30%, they will still be above the prices of March 2020 when people thought they were overvalued. It's just that if prices do come down by 25, 30% by next year, they won't be as badly overvalued as they were before.
For fear of getting that eyes glazing over by diving too deep into the separation of fiscal policy and monetary policy, as you mentioned, some Canadian politicians have somewhat washed their hands of what's going on in terms of inflation, just saying, we feel your pain, or here, we're going to cut you a little check. Realistically, is there anything a federal government, a provincial government can do to try and ease some of this pain, or maybe even stop some of the inflation, short of doing what Quebec did, which was, here's a check for $500?
Yeah, another excellent question. Of course, there's things government can do because the fiscal power, the authority of the Minister of Finance is essentially unlimited. And this has been tested. I'm not a lawyer, but I certainly study these decisions because it affects business and finance, which is what I teach. This has been the authority of the the Minister of Finance over the last 50 years, 70 years has been tested and gone all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has ruled consistently that the federal government has essentially unlimited authority. If it wants to raise the GST, it has the authority to do so. If it wants to cut it, it can do so. If it wants to impose a carbon tax, as the court just ruled, it can do so. So the question is, do they have the authority? Yes, they do. The question is, ought they to do something? And that's a different question. I would argue the following, that if they do introduce some kind of relief or assistance or help or support, it should be targeted. It should not go to professors like me or people that are bankers or medical doctors making very, very big salaries.
Or broadcasters like me. Don't give the freebies to the media either. Yep.
Lower people with lower income in the bottom, let's say 30 or 40% of the population, to use the technical language, the bottom quintiles, which just means the bottom 40%, because their incomes are much, much lower. And the government could do that, as they're doing now, by the way. I mean, the GST rebate check does not go to me. It goes to low income or much lower income people. Well, fair enough. Most of our income support programs are targeted to lower income. You don't get social assistance or unemployment insurance if you're working and making $100,000 a year. I mean, we all know that. And the same with the carbon tax rebates. They're targeted to lower income people. So yes, they could say, okay, we're going to, for the next 6 months or 12 months or 9 months or whatever, we're going to issue a temporary rebate to people below, I'll just make up a number, people below $50,000. And very quickly on this point, because people may say, well, how can we do that? Because the Prime Minister back in March 20 said we couldn't target the support for the CERB and so forth. The CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, has awesome data, unbelievably awesome data on over 31 million people in Canada, because we file tax returns and we tell the CRA how much we make. And we tell them whether we own a house, how many children or dependents we have, whether we have an elderly parent living with us. We tell them whether we're divorced, married, whatever. So my point is, there's an awesome database there. It's digitized and digital, and they can that's how they're dispersing the GST rebate check, and the carbon tax is done through the CRA database. So you just reverse the pipeline. Instead of sending money into the government sends money out to you. Think of it as sort of a negative income tax. And so the government could target support to people below a certain income threshold. If they do provide support, that's much better than giving indiscriminate support to everybody, including people like me that do not deserve it or need it.
Dr. Lee, one last question, because I know you're busy and you probably have a million media members calling you today for your thoughts, but looking at the data today, and I don't mean to sort of look at one micro set of data as anything in particular, but the sticker shock obviously is the 8.1% year over year increase. Yes. I take a little optimism in seeing that it's 0.4% month over month. And not to extrapolate too far, but that would be 4.8% year over year. Do you sense that we could see some natural easing that's going on due to some supply shocks, whether that be the pandemic or the war, and even the monetary policy changes by the Bank of Canada? Do you see over time here, short-term, medium, long-term, some easing in inflation?
I do. And I'm not here to be a cheerleader for Governor Macklem. I've met him 2 or 3 times in downtown Ottawa. I'm not trying to suggest he's my friend. He's not. I just met him purely professionally, shake his hand. How are you? He's a very smart guy. He's very experienced. I have been critical that they didn't move as quickly as they should have in raising rates a year ago. But I read every speech, every publication, everything that comes out of the Bank of Canada from the governor, because it's very important stuff. And they're predicting a decline by next year. And I find it reasonable and even compelling. Nobody is suggesting that oil is going to go from $100 a barrel. No serious forecaster is suggesting it's going to drive up to $150 or $200 a barrel. I think we're near the peak on oil. And the inflation, the interest rates themselves are biting. They are impacting on us. It is starting to cool the economy. We can see it in declining house prices in the GTA, in Vancouver, in Ottawa, and other big cities. So I think we're probably near peak inflation now in the 8s. I do not think it's going to go double digit. And so I think by next year, 2023, so I'm not talking 50 years or 20 years from now. By next year, it might be down, and the Bank of Canada is forecasting in the 4.5% to 5% range. And by 2024, they're suggesting it'll be down to the 2 to 3% range. I think that's credible for all the things we've discussed. The supply chain is going to come back into balance. It will eventually rebalance over time. Supply and demand will come back into balance. I think the oil prices will come down somewhat. Department of Energy and the U.S. government is forecasting 80-85 a barrel next year, not 110. So I think you've asked an excellent question. I think we're probably at or almost at the very peak of the inflation increases. And now we're going to start to slowly go down that hill. And it's going to take a couple of years or even 3 years to bring it back into balance, into long-term balance in the 2% range.
Dr. Lee, we're grateful for your perspective on these issues this morning. Thank you for making us a little bit smarter on this issue.
I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you and your listeners. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That is Dr. Ian Lee, an Associate Professor of Management at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University in Ottawa. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI-télé or download the podcasts wherever you listen. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI-télé or download the podcasts wherever you listen.